The coffee spilled as a fist hit the table, the cup dancing dangerously before settling. Frank Montgomery watched the dark liquid form a small pool on the white Formica surface, but he made no move to wipe it. His fingers, marked by almost imperceptible scars, gripped the edge of the table with silent force that made the veins stand out beneath his aged skin. Hey, old man, careful with the dishes. Not like you can afford to replace them with that measly government pension, right? The rough laughter filled the small roadside diner, where Frank had been having breakfast every day for over 15 years. The scent of fried eggs and toast now mixed with the smell of damp leather and gasoline. Frank didn't need to look up to know who had arrived. Jason and his biker gang, their jackets decorated with patches that told stories of the road, but none of true sacrifice. Frank felt the weight of his 64 years that morning more than ever. Not because of the pain in his knee that had plagued him since the explosion in Iraq, nor the invisible scars that woke him in the middle of the night, sweating and gasping. It was the exhaustion of fighting battles no one else could see or understand. "Is there a problem with my coffee, kid?" Frank asked, his low, controlled voice contrasting with the storm brewing behind his blue eyes. Jason, a man in his early 30s with an unkempt beard and tribal tattoos covering his arms, stepped closer. The stench of cheap whiskey clung to his breath. "Even at this early hour, the problem is you're sitting at our favorite table, old man, and we're in a hurry." The entire diner seemed to hold its breath. Sarah, the waitress who had served Frank for years, froze mid-step, the coffee pot suspended in the air like an uncertain weapon. At the counter, Cook Ed stopped beating the eggs, his spatula motionless above the hot griddle. "There are at least 5 empty tables," Frank replied, slowly gesturing to the nearly deserted diner at 6:30 on a Wednesday morning. "And I'm not done with my coffee." Jason leaned in further, invading Frank's personal space. His bloodshot eyes gleamed with youthful defiance, the kind of artificial courage that comes bottled. "Maybe you didn't hear me right. That wasn't a request." Frank met Jason's gaze without flinching. For an instant, something old and dangerous flickered in the veteran's eyes, a glimmer of the same resolve that had kept him alive while younger, stronger men had fallen around him in the desert. "Son," Frank said, each word precise as measured gunfire, "I've been having my coffee here every morning since before you were old enough to ride that bike. I suggest you find another spot." One of Jason's friends, a man wearing a leather vest covered in metal studs, laughed nervously. "Come on, Jay. Not worth it. There are other tables." But Jason was too invested now. His ego, fed by years of successful intimidation, couldn't accept the silent challenge in the older man's eyes. "Do you even know who we are? Do you have any idea what we could do to you in the parking lot?" Frank took a sip of his coffee with the same calm as someone watching clouds pass on a quiet day. "I know exactly who you are. Boys playing at being dangerous without ever having faced real danger." Rage flashed across Jason's face like lightning. He reached out to grab Frank's collar. That was his mistake. A movement so fluid it barely seemed possible for a man Frank's age. Jason's hand was deflected with pinpoint precision. In the next instant, the biker was on the floor, absolute shock on his face, while Frank remained seated, as calm as ever, as if he had merely swatted away an annoying fly. "What the hell?" Jason stammered, trying to process what happened as his friends watched, dumbfounded. Frank showed no triumph or satisfaction. There was only quiet sadness in his eyes, as if he had expected more from this encounter. "Never mistake age for weakness, son. Some lessons cost more than you can afford." Jason's lip bled where he had hit the floor. His friends, once so confident, now kept their distance, unsure of what to do. The balance of power had shifted completely in seconds. "You're dead, old man." Jason spat, trying to reclaim some dignity as he stood. "You know what happened to the last guy who put his hands on me? He's still eating through a tube." Frank placed a few dollars on the table beside his coffee cup. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, fearless. "Threats are the refuge of weak men, son. I learned that in places you wouldn't even find on a map. As Frank stood, something in his posture made the bikers instinctively step back. It wasn't his height or size. Frank was of average build and, though still fit for his age, he didn't have the bulk of his younger adversaries. It was something deeper and more primal, the instinctive recognition of a more experienced predator. "You don't know who I am," Jason continued, his voice now louder, as if volume could compensate for his lost authority. Frank adjusted his simple canvas jacket, the worn sleeves briefly revealing a scar on his wrist. "I know more than you think. I know you're a man who's never had to prove his worth for real. And that, son, is a greater tragedy than you realize." The tension in the diner was palpable, electric. Sarah had retreated behind the counter, phone in hand, ready to call the police. The other customers watched in silence, unwilling witnesses to a confrontation that went far beyond the physical. In the eyes of the other bikers, Frank could see the growing uncertainty. Too young to understand true strength, but old enough to recognize when they were facing something they couldn't fully comprehend. The silence was interrupted by the distant sound of approaching motorcycles. Many of them. Jason's eyes narrowed in suspicion. "You call for backup, old man?" Frank merely glanced at his watch, an old Timex that had survived sand, blood, and tears. A small smile touched his lips, the first since the bikers had entered. "Time always brings its own answers, son," he said, his voice carrying a weight that even Jason hesitated at. "Some battles you choose. Others choose you." And as the roar of motorcycles grew closer, Frank Montgomery remained still, a silent sentinel of a world these young men had never known. A world where a man's true test wasn't in intimidating the weak, but in protecting them at all costs. The roar of the motorcycles grew until it became a mechanical symphony that made the diner's windows tremble. Frank kept his eyes on Jason, like an unshaken lighthouse in the face of a storm. The door opened, bringing with it the scent of hot asphalt and motor oil. Mark Wilson entered first, his broad silhouette filling the doorway. Behind him, more men began to file in, a dozen of them, all carrying the same posture that spoke of discipline and purpose. They weren't just men. They were soldiers, even years after taking off their uniforms for the last time. "Montgomery," Mark called out, his weathered face breaking into a smile. His eyes, however, quickly assessed the scene. The spilled coffee, Jason's bleeding lip, the palpable tension in the air. "Starting the party without us?" Something in Frank's face softened, almost imperceptibly around the eyes. "Just entertaining some unexpected guests." Jason's bikers huddled in a corner, suddenly aware that the dynamic had changed. They were no longer the predators, but potential prey. At the counter, Tommy watched everything unfold, his sandwich forgotten in front of him. This was a side of his grandfather he had never seen. Not the gentleman who taught him to fish on Sundays, but a silent warrior with a story that had never been fully told. Mark approached Frank, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. 33rd anniversary, old friend." Frank nodded, a nearly imperceptible movement. "Time flies." The date needed no explanation between them. It was the anniversary of the first day they had set foot on Iraq's scorching sand. Too young to grasp what awaited them, too old to ever forget. Jason, regaining some composure, wiped the blood from his lip. "Who the hell are you?" "Some kind of retirement club for bikers." A heavy silence fell over the diner. Sarah, the waitress, closed her eyes briefly, as if praying for patience. It was Daniel Carter who answered, a broad-shouldered black man whose hands bore intricate surgical scars. "We're what's left of the Eagle Platoon, 7th Regiment. And that man you tried to intimidate." He pointed at Frank. "He saved more lives in a single day than you probably helped in your entire existence." Tommy slowly stepped forward, drawn in by the story that was about to unfold. Frank noticed his grandson's presence, and something in his expression changed, a vulnerability that only appeared when he looked at the boy. "Tommy," Frank said gently, "you got here early." "I wanted to surprise you, Grandpa." Tommy replied, his eyes darting between Frank and the newcomers. "Are these your army friends?" Mark smiled at the boy. "We're family, kid. The kind of family you build when you trust each other with your lives." Jason and his crew started backing toward the door, their previous bravado completely gone. "Let's get out of here," he muttered to his group. "This place is too crowded now." Frank didn't watch them leave. Instead, his eyes met Tommy's, and for the first time, the boy saw something he had never noticed before, a deep sadness mixed with quiet pride. "Your grandfather," Daniel said, stepping beside Tommy, "carried 3 wounded men across half a kilometer of open ground under enemy fire. Never asked for anything in return, not even a thank you." Tommy looked at Frank with new eyes, not as a grandfather who fixed broken bikes and told stories at night, but as a man who had faced humanity's worst and still managed to find goodness within himself. The scars Frank carried, Tommy was beginning to understand, weren't just marks on his skin. They were maps of a journey that had shaped every part of the man his grandfather had become. And as the veteran settled around the table, fresh cups of coffee being passed around, Tommy realized he was about to learn a lesson far more valuable than any classroom could ever teach, about courage, sacrifice, and the kind of strength that doesn't come from muscles, but from the soul. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the air as the veterans settled around the table. Tommy stayed close to his grandfather, absorbing every word exchanged between these men. Their hands, some trembling, others marked by scars, told stories without needing words. On the other side of the diner, Jason and his bikers watched the group with a mix of resentment and wounded pride. Jason's lip was still bleeding from where he had hit the floor. His companions murmured among themselves, casting defiant glances toward Frank. "That old man is going to regret this," Jason muttered, running his finger over the cut. "This isn't over." Mark pulled out a faded photograph and slid it toward Frank. "Remember Dave? His son finally graduated from medical school." Frank held the picture with the care of someone touching a sacred relic. Dave would be proud. His voice wavered slightly, carrying a weight Tommy had never noticed before. "Who's Dave?" Tommy asked, leaning in to see the photo. A heavy silence fell over the table. The men exchanged looks filled with shared pain, almost tangible. Then Jason suddenly stood, knocking over his chair. The noise cut through the air like a gunshot. "Hey, old man," he called, his voice slurred with alcohol. "We're not done talking." Frank slowly raised his eyes, meeting Jason's gaze. There was no anger there, only a deep sadness that made Tommy shiver. The diner door creaked open. A woman in her 60s stepped in, her poised demeanor contrasting with the modest surroundings. She paused for a moment, scanning the room until her eyes landed on Jason. Instantly, her expression hardened. "Jason William Peterson." Her voice sliced through the silence like a blade. "What do you think you're doing?" Jason's face changed completely. His bravado vanished, replaced by a mix of surprise and youthful embarrassment. "Mom, what are you doing here?" The word mom fell like a bomb in the small diner. Frank visibly paled, gripping the edge of the table as if his legs might give out. "Catherine," he whispered, the name escaping like an unfinished prayer. The woman turned to Frank, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. Her eyes, the same shade of blue as Jason's, widened in recognition. "Frank Montgomery," she said, her voice now softer, almost fragile. "After all these years." Tommy looked from his grandfather to the woman, then to Jason, trying to connect the pieces of a puzzle he didn't know existed. Catherine walked toward the biker's table. "You," she said to Jason's companions, "wait outside. Now." There was an authority in her voice that allowed no room for argument. The young men rose almost in unison, casting confused glances at Jason, who seemed to shrink under his mother's gaze. "But Mom," Jason began, "that old man—" "That man," Catherine interrupted him, "is someone you should be treating with respect. Now, go wait in the car. You and I are going to have a long talk later." Jason hesitated, his pride battling the ingrained habit of obedience. Finally, he stood and followed his friends outside, though not without throwing one last confused look at Frank. When the door closed behind them, Catherine turned to the veteran's table. The silence in the diner was almost tangible, as if even the air had frozen. "You started without me," she said, approaching with deliberate steps. Mark stood instinctively beside Frank. "Catherine, we weren't expecting you." 33 years, Mr. Montgomery," she said, ignoring Mark and fixing her gaze on Frank. "I figured it was time." Tommy tugged lightly at his grandfather's sleeve. "Grandpa? Who is she?" Frank took a deep breath, like a man preparing to dive into deep waters. "Catherine is the daughter of Dave Peterson, our field medic." His voice was barely audible, but it carried the weight of decades of silence. "And that?" Tommy hesitated, glancing at the door where Jason had left. "That was your son." Catherine nodded slowly. "My son, who never knew the truth about his grandfather, or how he died." Frank looked to his comrades, a silent plea for help, but the other men lowered their eyes, as if they had already agreed this moment belonged to him alone. "Your father saved my life," Frank began, his hands now trembling over the table. "But what no one ever told you is that I was the one who gave the order that sent him into that building. I knew it was risky, but we needed that position. I sent your father to his death, Catherine." The confession hung in the air like smoke after a fire, suffocating, inescapable. Tommy felt his chest tighten as he watched his grandfather, the man he had always seen as a pillar of strength, crumble before his eyes. "All these years," Catherine whispered, tears now streaming freely down her face, "I raised my son to hate the war that took the father he never knew, and now he walks into a fight with the very man who..." Her words trailed off, incomplete yet perfectly understood by everyone in the room. Tommy watched, a silent witness to a past emerging from the shadows, connecting 3 generations in a perfect circle of pain, loss, and perhaps redemption. Outside, the motorcycles remained still, as if even the metal and chrome respected the weight of the truths being revealed inside that small roadside diner. The silence that filled the diner was as heavy as thick fog after a storm. Frank kept his eyes fixed on his coffee cup, unable to face Catherine. His fingers, marked by years of hard work and even harder memories, trembled slightly against the porcelain. "All these years," Catherine finally said, her voice breaking the silence like a delicate whisper. "All these years, I wondered why you showed up at the funeral, why you sent birthday cards, why you cared so much." Tommy watched his grandfather, this man who had always seemed like a beacon of strength and certainty, now hunched under the weight of guilt he had carried for more than 3 decades. "Catherine, Frank started, but the words seemed to abandon him. "I don't want your apologies," she interrupted, but without hostility. There was something different in her voice now, an exhaustion that spoke of sleepless nights and unanswered questions. "I want the truth. The real story of what happened that day." Mark placed a gentle hand on Frank's shoulder. "Maybe this isn't the time or the place." Catherine shook her head. 33 years, Mr. Wilson. I think I've waited long enough." At that moment, the diner door opened again. Jason walked back in, his face a mask of confusion and contained anger. He stopped a few steps away, his eyes darting between his mother and Frank. "Mom, the guys are asking if we're leaving or not. What's going on here?" His voice carried a vulnerability that contrasted with the arrogance he had displayed earlier. Frank finally raised his eyes, meeting Jason's gaze. The young man, so full of rage just moments ago, now looked merely lost, as if he had stumbled into a story too big for him to understand. "Jason," Catherine called softly, "come here. There's something you need to know." Tommy felt his heart pounding as Jason hesitantly stepped forward. There was a strange parallel between them. 2 grandsons, 2 young men whose lives had been shaped by events that had happened long before they were born. "This man," Catherine said, indicating Frank, "served with your grandfather in Iraq. He was there the day that..." Her words hung in the air, heavy as lead. Jason looked at Frank with new eyes, comprehension slowly replacing his confusion. You knew my grandfather? There was something almost childlike in the way he asked the question, something that made Tommy's chest tighten. Frank nodded slowly. Dave Peterson was the best man I ever knew, the best medic, the best friend. He died a hero, Mark added quietly. He saved more lives in that unit than any of us. Jason pulled out a chair and sat next to his mother, his earlier aggressive stance completely gone. You never talk about him, he said to Catherine, almost accusingly. How could I? Catherine responded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. All I had were secondhand stories. Official reports that never felt complete. Frank took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to step into the darkness. Your grandfather died because I sent him into that building, Jason. I was the unit commander. The responsibility was mine. The words hung in the air like smoke. Jason looked at Frank, then at his mother. Is that why you came here today? To confront him? Catherine placed a hand over her son's. I came here to find answers. To understand why this man never stopped caring about our family, even after all these years. Tommy observed his grandfather, realizing that there were layers to him he had never seen before. He wasn't just a veteran who had faced rowdy bikers in a diner. He was a man carrying an invisible burden, a debt that could never truly be repaid. I made him a promise, Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. When I held him in my arms for the last time, I promised I would take care of you, Catherine, that I would never let your family go without. A single tear finally escaped, tracing a slow path down Frank's weathered face. I failed your father. I couldn't fail you too. The silence that followed wasn't empty, but full of long-buried truths, of wounds finally exposed to the light. Tommy felt something shift in that small diner, as if a long-closed door was finally beginning to open. Sarah, the waitress, placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of Jason, who accepted it with a silent nod. The young man who had walked into the diner, looking for a fight, now seemed smaller, more vulnerable, like a child realizing the world was far more complex than he had imagined. You sent me birthday cards, Jason suddenly said, looking at Frank. The ones that arrived with no return address, but always with an eagle drawn in the corner. That was you, wasn't it? Frank nodded, his throat too tight to speak. His aged hands gripped the coffee cup, as if drawing warmth from it. Why didn't you ever sign them? Jason's voice carried a mix of confusion and accusation. Why always from a distance? Catherine placed a hand over her son's. Jason, there are things you don't know. Things I never fully knew myself. Then tell me, Jason insisted, now looking at his mother. All these years, you told me Grandpa died a hero, but you never told me how or why. I grew up with a ghost, not a story. Tommy watched the scene unfold, feeling strangely connected to this young man who, just minutes ago, had seemed so different from him. Now he saw in Jason the same longing he himself felt, to understand the shadows that shaped their family legacies. Your grandfather and I had a mission, Frank began, his voice growing steadier. We needed to protect civilians in a neighborhood south of Baghdad. Intel suggested there were snipers in a nearby building. Mark shifted slightly, as if wanting to interrupt, but Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder, silencing him with a look. I was a commander, Frank continued. I sent Dave, your grandfather, with a small medical team to evacuate a family that had been left behind. The building seemed safe. Our intel said it was clear. But it wasn't, Catherine finished, her voice barely a whisper. No, it wasn't, Frank confirmed, the weight of those words visible in his hunched shoulders. Jason leaned forward, completely absorbed in the story. What happened? An ambush, Daniel interjected, his voice low. They weren't just isolated snipers. It was a trap. Frank closed his eyes for a moment, as if he could see that day playing out behind his eyelids. By the time we realized, it was too late. Your grandfather, he got the family out. All 5 children made it out unharmed. But when he went back for the last injured civilian, the silence that followed said more than any words ever could. "It wasn't your fault," Catherine said softly, surprising everyone. "Not even you could have predicted that." Frank opened his eyes, a single tear slipping down his lined face. "It was my responsibility. I should have—" "What?" Catherine interrupted, years of bottled-up anger finally giving way to something deeper. "Ignored the family? Let the children die? The man I married, Jason's father, would have made the same choice you did." That was when she pulled a time-worn letter from her purse, its edges folded and refolded so many times that the creases had become permanent. "I found this after my mother passed away last year," she explained, sliding the letter toward Frank. "She never showed it to me. Said it was better if I didn't know." Frank unfolded the letter with trembling fingers, his eyes scanning the words written in a familiar handwriting he hadn't seen in more than 3 decades. The color drained from his face. "What does it say?" Tommy asked, unable to contain his curiosity. "It's from Dave," Frank whispered, his voice barely audible. "Written the night before that mission." Jason moved closer, as if he could somehow absorb his grandfather's presence through those words. "If something happens to me," Frank read aloud, "don't blame Frank. We both knew the risks. He carries the weight of the world on his shoulders. Tell him I chose this path. Tell him to live without guilt." The diner seemed to freeze in time. The letter trembled in Frank's hands, not just from his fingers' weakness, but as if the very paper carried the energy of the truth kept silent for too long. "He knew," Frank whispered. "He knew it was dangerous, even when I assured him it was safe. And he went anyway," Catherine added, tears now freely falling down her face. "Because that's who he was." Jason looked at the old man in front of him with new eyes. Not as a stranger, not as an enemy, but as an essential piece of the puzzle he had spent his whole life trying to assemble without knowing. The morning sunlight streamed to the diner windows, creating tiny rainbows and tears on Catherine's face. Dave's letter rested on the table, its yellowed paper holding words that, now finally spoken, seemed to fill the air with a nearly tangible relief. "All these years," Frank murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "All these years carrying a weight he never wanted me to bear." Jason stared at the letter, as if it were a newly discovered treasure. His fingers lightly brushed the edge of the paper, as if through that contact, he could feel the presence of the grandfather he had never known. "Did he mention me?" Jason asked, his voice stripped of all previous hostility. "Did he know I would exist?" Catherine smiled through her tears. "He didn't know I was pregnant. I found out just a week after." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Tommy watched Jason's transformation with a quiet understanding. There was a parallel between them. 2 grandsons seeking to understand the men who had shaped their histories, even without ever having met them. "I have something for you," Frank said, carefully reaching into the inner pocket of his worn jacket. "I've been carrying this for 33 years, waiting for the right moment." Frank's hands trembled as he opened a small metal box. Inside, a silver pocket watch rested on a faded piece of cloth. "It belonged to your grandfather. He received it from his father, who served in World War II." Jason took the watch with reverence. When he opened it, a small piece of folded paper fell onto the table, a faded photograph of young Dave Peterson, smiling beside Frank. Both were in military uniforms, arms slung around each other's shoulders, the Iraqi desert stretching endlessly behind them. "We were so young," Frank murmured, his voice thick with memories. "So sure we were invincible." Jason held the watch as if it were made of glass. "Why now? Why not sooner?" Frank looked up, meeting not only Jason's gaze, but also Catherine's. "Because we promised each other, all of us who made it back that day, that we would honor your grandmother's wishes. She believed it was better if you didn't know the details, that the pain was too great. My mother always protecting everyone," Catherine said with a sad smile, "even after she was gone." Mark cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. Dave saved each of us at some point, not just as a medic, but as a friend. When we lost him, his voice faltered. A part of us never came home. Then Jason did something no one expected. He reached out and extended his hand toward Frank, not as a challenge, but as an offering of peace. "I'm sorry," he said, the word simple but heavy with meaning. For not knowing. Frank accepted the handshake, and in that moment, something shifted in the diner. A circle that had begun forming decades ago in a distant desert finally closed. Tommy felt a lump rise in his throat as he witnessed the transformation. His grandfather, the man he had admired without truly knowing, now took on new dimensions before his eyes. He was not just a quiet veteran who fished on Sundays, but a man who had carried the weight of battlefield promises. A man whose life had been intertwined with others in ways only now becoming visible. "Maybe," Catherine said softly, "it's time to stop honoring the dead with silence. Maybe the real honor is in telling their stories." Outside, the sun rose higher in the sky. The motorcycles in the parking lot gleamed under the morning light, no longer symbols of intimidation, but simply vehicles that had brought people whose fates were more connected than they ever could have imagined. And in that small roadside diner, where a spilled cup of coffee had set off a morning of confrontations, something new and unexpected was born, a bond restored and chain that stretched across generations, forged not in the heat of battle, but in the shared understanding that some debts never needed to be repaid. The golden morning light had turned into the bright clarity of midday when the bikers began to leave the parking lot. Jason lingered behind, his grandfather's watch safely in his pocket. Its weight now carried more than just metal. It held history and newfound meaning. "They can go," Jason said, motioning to his friends. "I think I have a lot to learn here." Catherine smiled at her son, a smile different from any Tommy had ever seen before. It was something between pride and relief, as if an invisible weight had finally been lifted from her shoulders. "This diner," Frank said, running his fingers over the worn surface of the table, "was the first place I found when I got back. A place where no one asked questions about the scars or the nightmares." Daniel nodded. "For all of us, a meeting point where we could just be men drinking coffee, not symbols or statistics." Tommy sat beside his grandfather, realizing he had never truly looked at Frank's hands before. Hands that held weapons and later carpentry tools. Hands that had written anonymous birthday cards to a boy he had never met. "Why didn't you ever tell me all this, Grandpa?" Tommy asked, his voice soft. Frank placed a firm hand on his grandson's shoulder. "Some stories are hard to tell, Tommy. Not because we want to hide them, but because we don't always know how to shape the words." Jason moved closer, sitting on Frank's other side. "And some stories need to wait for the right moment to be heard," he added, surprising everyone with his sudden understanding. The contrast between the two young men, Tommy, always respectful and attentive, and Jason, who had entered the diner full of reckless anger, now seemed to fade away. They were both just young men trying to understand the legacy that had shaped their lives, even without knowing it. "War teaches us terrible things," Mark said, breaking the silence. "But it also teaches us about loyalty, about promises you keep no matter the cost. My father used to say that the true measure of a man isn't what he does when everyone is watching," Catherine reflected, "but the promises he keeps when no one is looking." Frank took a deep breath, and Tommy noticed how different his grandfather seemed now, as if years of tension were dissolving before his eyes. "Dave knew he wouldn't come back from that mission," Frank said, his words falling softly into the silence. "I realize it now. He chose to go anyway, not for heroism or glory, but because there were people who needed him." Jason held the watch, opening it again to look at the photograph. What was he like? Not just the stories people tell about heroes. What was he really like? A genuine smile spread across Frank's face. He had the most annoying laugh you've ever heard, like a goose choking on a whistle. The unexpected description drew laughter from the table, and he told the worst jokes. For an hour, stories flowed, not just about battles and bravery, but about human moments, flaws, and shared laughter. Tommy watched as Jason absorbed every word, every fragment of the grandfather he had never met. When they finally stood to leave, the afternoon sun bathed the parking lot in golden light. Catherine embraced Frank, not with a formal forgiveness of obligation, but with the warmth of rediscovering a long-lost connection. "Sunday," she said, stepping back slightly. "Dinner at my house. All of you." Jason turned to Tommy, extending a hand. "Sorry about earlier. Looks like we're almost family in a way." Tommy shook his hand, feeling as if he were witnessing the closing of a circle that had begun long before he was born. "Family," he agreed. Frank watched the two young men, and in his eyes, there was a peace Tommy had never seen before. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of something stronger, the understanding that some wounds, once finally exposed to the light, begin to heal in ways we never imagined possible. And in Jason's pocket, Dave Peterson's watch ticked again, not just marking hours and minutes, but the continuation of stories that intertwine, get lost, and sometimes, with enough luck, find their way back to each other.